The wedding day was supposed to be the happiest moment of Emma's life. She had dreamed of this day since she was a little girl, imagining the white dress, the flowers, the music, and the walk down the aisle to the man she loved. Everything was perfect, or so she thought. The venue was stunning, the guests were already seated, and the soft hum of violins set the atmosphere. But just as Emma stepped out of the bridal suite, ready to take her first steps toward a new chapter, something unexpected happened. Charlie, her golden retriever and constant companion for the past 7 years, stood in her path. Dressed in a little bow tie that matched her bouquet, he looked adorable, but there was something about his stance, firm, almost defiant, that stopped her in her tracks. Charlie wasn't wagging his tail like he usually did when he saw her, and his big brown eyes were filled with something Emma couldn't quite place. Sadness? Fear? Worry? "Charlie, what's wrong?" she whispered, crouching down to pet him, careful not to wrinkle her dress. But he didn't move. Instead, he let out a soft whine and nudged her hand with his nose, as if trying to tell her something. Guests began to murmur from their seats, craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. The wedding coordinator rushed over, her clipboard clutched tightly, a look of panic on her face. "Emma, we're ready to start," she said, glancing nervously at the dog. Emma's fiancé, James, stood at the altar, looking confused. His eyes met hers across the room, and he gave her a reassuring smile, but even from a distance, she could tell he was wondering what was going on. "Charlie, come on, boy." "Not now," Emma said softly, trying to coax him to the side so she could pass. But Charlie didn't budge. He let out another low whine and then barked, a short, sharp sound that made everyone in the room go silent. That bark sent a shiver down Emma's spine. Charlie was always so well-behaved, so calm. For him to act this way, especially in such an important moment, was completely out of character. She glanced around, suddenly feeling a little uneasy. The wedding coordinator cleared her throat, clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "Maybe we can have someone take him outside," she suggested, her voice strained. But Emma shook her head. Something told her this wasn't just a case of her dog acting up. Charlie wasn't the kind of dog to misbehave for no reason. He was loyal, protective, and incredibly smart. If he was standing in her way, there had to be a reason. Taking a deep breath, Emma stood up and looked at Charlie again. "What is it, boy? What are you trying to tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charlie whined again and took a step forward, nudging her leg with his nose. Then he turned his head slightly, looking toward the door behind her. Emma followed his gaze and froze. She couldn't see anything unusual at first, but then she noticed the faintest sound, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching noise coming from outside the bridal suite. It was so faint that if the room hadn't fallen completely silent after Charlie's bark, she might not have heard it at all. Emma's heart began to race. What was out there? And why was Charlie so insistent on stopping her from walking down the aisle? She glanced back at the dog, who was now staring at her with those soulful eyes, as if pleading with her to trust him. The coordinator tapped her on the shoulder, her voice barely concealing her irritation. "Emma, we're running behind. You need to start now." But Emma couldn't move. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her gut. Ignoring the coordinator and the murmurs from the guests, she turned toward the door and took a step forward. Charlie immediately followed, staying close by her side. "What's going on, Emma?" James called from the altar, his voice breaking the tense silence. Emma turned to him, her face pale. "I don't know," she said honestly. Then, looking down at Charlie, she added, "But I need to find out." With Charlie leading the way, Emma reached for the door handle. As she opened it, the scratching sound grew louder, more frantic. And what she saw on the other side made her gasp, her heart sinking into her chest. Whatever was waiting for her out there wasn't just a random coincidence, it was something that would change everything. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes locked on the scene unfolding before her. Outside the bridal suite, just beyond the neatly arranged flower arch that framed the entrance, was a small bundle of fur trembling on the floor. At first, she thought it might be another dog, but as she stepped closer, she realized it was a puppy, tiny, malnourished, and visibly frightened. The puppy's ribs were prominent beneath its scruffy coat, and its wide, panicked eyes darted around as if it had been lost for days. Its little paws were scratched and dirty, and it let out a faint, pitiful whimper that tugged at Emma's heartstrings. Charlie barked again, but this time it wasn't sharp or urgent. It was softer, almost like he was trying to communicate something. He moved closer to the puppy, sniffing it carefully before turning back to Emma with a look that seemed to say, "Help her." Emma knelt down, her pristine white dress pooling around her as she reached out to the tiny creature. "Oh, sweetheart, where did you come from?" she murmured. The puppy flinched at first but didn't run. Instead, it curled into itself, trembling even more. The coordinator's voice broke through the tension. "Emma, this is absurd. We need to start the ceremony now. Someone can deal with whatever this is." Emma ignored her. She couldn't just walk away. This wasn't just some random interruption. There was a reason Charlie had blocked her path, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was important, like fate was stepping in. "Charlie must have smelled her," Emma said aloud, mostly to herself. She gently scooped up the puppy, cradling its fragile body in her arms. The poor thing felt so light, like it hadn't eaten in days. "Emma!" James's voice called out again, louder this time, but there was no anger in it, just confusion and a hint of concern. She turned to face him, holding the puppy close. "There's a puppy out here," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. She's in bad shape. I think she needs help." James stepped down from the altar, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor as he walked toward her. The guests began to murmur again, whispers rippling through the crowd like a wave. "A puppy?" James asked, reaching her side. His eyes widened when he saw the tiny creature in her arms. "Where did she come from?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. "But Charlie found her. He wouldn't let me walk down the aisle until I saw her." James looked down at Charlie, who wagged his tail slightly, as if proud of himself. Then he looked back at Emma, his expression softening. "She's in rough shape. We should call a vet." The coordinator let out an exasperated sigh, throwing her hands in the air. "Are we seriously pausing a wedding for a stray dog?" Emma stood up, holding the puppy securely. She turned to face the coordinator, her voice firm despite the emotions swirling inside her. "This isn't just a stray dog. She needs us. Right now." James put a hand on her shoulder. "We can do this together," he said quietly, his support giving her strength. The guests were watching now, some with curiosity, others with smiles of approval. Emma could see her parents in the front row, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. For a moment, Emma hesitated. This was supposed to be her big day. Everything had been planned down to the last detail. But as she looked at the fragile puppy in her arms and the loyal dog at her side, she realized something important. Life wasn't about perfect plans, it was about doing what felt right, even when it was unexpected. She looked at James, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "Can we do both?" she asked. "Help her and still get married?" James smiled. "Of course we can. Let's make this part of our story." With that, Emma carried the puppy back inside, Charlie trotting close behind. The wedding coordinator reluctantly followed, muttering about schedules and timing, but Emma didn't care. She was about to walk down the aisle with her best friend, her soon-to-be husband, and a tiny new life in her arms. But as they approached the altar, the puppy let out a soft cry, and Emma noticed something she hadn't before, a small tag hanging from a frayed piece of string around its neck. It was barely visible beneath the dirt and fur, but when she brushed it off, her breath caught in her throat. The tag was engraved with a single name, and it wasn't random. It was a name that held a connection to her past, a past she thought she had moved on from. Her hands trembled as she turned the tag over, revealing a date etched beneath the name. A date that made her heart race. She looked at James, her voice shaking. "I think this puppy is here for a reason. And I think it's connected to me." Emma stared at the tag, her fingers trembling as she traced the engraving. The name on it was Daisy. That name struck her like a bolt of lightning, unlocking memories she hadn't visited in years. Daisy had been the name of her childhood dog, the sweet Labrador who had been her best friend through her teenage years. Losing Daisy had been one of the hardest things Emma had ever gone through. She remembered crying for weeks after Daisy passed, clutching the dog's favorite toy and feeling the ache of an emptiness that no other pet could ever fill. But this couldn't be connected, could it? Daisy had been gone for over a decade, and this puppy was far too young to have any connection to her beloved childhood dog. Yet seeing that name on the tag felt like more than just a coincidence. The date etched below it was equally strange. It was the exact day Emma had met James for the first time, at a local park where he had stopped to help her untangle Charlie's leash from a bench. That day had felt like fate, just as this moment now seemed to. James leaned closer, concern etched across his face. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Emma held the tag up for him to see. "Look at this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It says Daisy. And the date, it's the day we met." James frowned, his gaze flickering between the tag and Emma's face. "That's odd," he admitted. "Do you think it's just a coincidence?" Emma shook her head. "I don't know. But it feels like it's more than that." She glanced down at the puppy, who was now curled up in her arms, her trembling less noticeable. Charlie sat at her feet, watching her closely, as if he, too, understood the weight of this moment. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, a mix of curiosity and confusion. Emma could feel the weight of their stares, but for the first time in her life, she didn't care what anyone thought. All that mattered was figuring out what this meant, why this puppy had shown up today, of all days, with a name and a date that seemed to tie into her life so deeply. Her mother approached hesitantly, her face a mixture of concern and love. "Emma, sweetheart," she said softly, "is everything all right?" Emma turned to her, holding out the tag. "Mom, look at this," she said. "Do you remember Daisy? This puppy's tag has her name on it, and this date. It's the day James and I met." Her mother's eyes widened as she took the tag in her hands. "Oh, Emma," she said, her voice trembling. This is strange. Almost eerie." Emma's father, who had been sitting quietly in the front row, stood up and joined them. He looked at the tag, then at the puppy. "Maybe someone left her here intentionally," he suggested. "But why? And how would they know those details about your life?" That was the question gnawing at Emma. Who would leave a puppy like this at a wedding? And why would they go to the trouble of engraving a tag with such personal information? It didn't make sense. The wedding coordinator, who had been hovering nearby with an increasingly frustrated expression, finally spoke up. "Listen, I don't mean to interrupt, but we really need to move forward with the ceremony. This is highly unusual, and your guests," Emma cut her off, her voice firm but polite. "I understand, but I need a moment to figure this out. Please." The coordinator pursed her lips but said nothing, stepping back to give Emma space. James, sensing the gravity of the situation, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Whatever this is, we'll figure it out," he said. "But maybe we should sit down for a minute, away from everyone, and think this through." Emma nodded, grateful for his calm presence. Together, they moved to a quieter corner of the venue, Charlie and the puppy following close behind. The guests remained seated, some watching with curiosity, others chatting quietly amongst themselves. As they sat down, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a strange coincidence. The puppy's condition, the name, the date, it all felt like a puzzle she was meant to solve. "Do you think someone's trying to send me a message?" she asked, looking at James. "It's possible," he replied thoughtfully. "But if that's the case, who would do this? And why?" Emma thought for a moment, her mind racing through possibilities. Could it be someone from her past? An old friend, or maybe a family member who wanted to remind her of Daisy? But that didn't explain the date. And it certainly didn't explain why the puppy was in such bad shape. Her thoughts were interrupted when Charlie let out a soft bark, drawing her attention back to the puppy. The little dog was now licking Charlie's face, her tiny tail wagging for the first time since Emma had picked her up. The sight brought a small smile to Emma's lips, but it also deepened the mystery. "Who are you, little one?" Emma murmured, stroking the puppy's head gently. "And why are you here?" James leaned in, examining the tag again. "Do you think there's any chance someone's trying to connect this to Daisy on purpose? Like, maybe they knew how much she meant to you?" Emma shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. Daisy was such a huge part of my life, but I can't think of anyone who would do this. It's not like I've talked about her to a lot of people." Her mother, who had quietly joined them, added, "Maybe it's not about Daisy at all. Maybe this is some kind of sign." "A sign of what?" Emma asked, her voice filled with both frustration and curiosity. Her mother hesitated, her gaze softening. "Sometimes things happen that we can't explain. Maybe this puppy came to you for a reason. Maybe she's here to remind you of something, or to help you with something you don't even know you need yet." Emma considered her mother's words. It wasn't like her to believe in signs or fate, but there was something about this situation that felt undeniably significant. As she looked down at the puppy, who was now snuggled against Charlie, Emma felt a strange mix of emotions: confusion, hope, and an unshakable sense of connection. Before she could say anything else, a loud knock echoed through the room. Everyone turned toward the main entrance, where a man in a worn jacket stood, holding a piece of paper in his hand. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot as if unsure whether he should come inside. James stood up first, walking over to the man. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. The man hesitated, glancing at the room full of people before finally speaking. I think I left something here earlier," he said, his voice shaky. "A puppy." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She stood up, still holding the puppy, and walked over to the man. "This puppy?" she asked, her voice laced with both suspicion and curiosity. The man's eyes widened when he saw her. "Yes," he said quickly. "That's her. Please, I need to explain." Emma tightened her hold on the puppy, her heart pounding. "Why did you leave her here?" she asked. "And what's with the tag?" The man looked down, his expression filled with guilt. "It's a long story," he said. "But I swear, I didn't mean any harm. I didn't know where else to go." Emma exchanged a glance with James, her curiosity deepening. She could tell the man wasn't dangerous; if anything, he seemed desperate. But his sudden appearance only added to the mystery. "Start from the beginning," Emma said, her voice steady but firm. "We need to know the truth." The man nodded, his face pale. "It's not what you think," he began. "But there's something you need to know about this puppy, and why I brought her here. It's all connected to something much bigger." Emma felt her pulse quicken as the man's cryptic words hung in the air. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the mystery pressing down like a heavy fog. She exchanged another glance with James, who nodded slightly, silently urging her to hear the man out. "All right," Emma said, her voice steady but tinged with impatience. "We're listening. Start from the beginning. Why did you leave her here, and what do you mean it's all connected to something bigger?" The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between Emma and the puppy in her arms. "My name's Paul," he began, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "I've been caring for this little one for the past few weeks. Found her abandoned near an old barn outside of town. She was in bad shape when I found her, worse than she is now." Emma glanced down at the puppy, her heart aching at the thought of her being left alone and scared in some forgotten place. But Paul's words didn't explain why he'd brought the puppy here, or why the tag had such personal details engraved on it. "Why did you bring her to my wedding?" Emma pressed, her voice sharp with urgency. Paul hesitated, his face clouded with guilt. "Because I didn't know what else to do," he said finally. "I found something strange when I was taking care of her. Something that pointed me here, to you." "What do you mean?" James asked, stepping forward. Paul reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he opened it and held it out for Emma to see. "I found this tied around her neck when I first picked her up. It was soaked from the rain, but I could still read the writing." Emma took the paper cautiously, her fingers brushing against its worn edges. The handwriting was faint but legible, scrawled in hurried, uneven strokes. The note read, "Take care of Daisy. She belongs with Emma." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the words, her mind racing. "Who wrote this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "And how do they know me?" Paul shook his head. "I don't know. I thought maybe the person who left her knew you personally. But I didn't have any way of finding out who you were until I noticed the date on her tag. I looked it up online, and that's when I saw your wedding announcement in the local paper." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that someone had orchestrated this, that they had gone to the trouble of engraving a tag, writing a note, and ensuring the puppy ended up in her hands, was both unsettling and deeply intriguing. James frowned, his expression hardening. "So, you just brought her here without knowing what this is all about?" "I didn't know what else to do," Paul said defensively. "I couldn't keep her. And after seeing the connection to you, I thought, maybe you'd know what it meant. Maybe it would make sense to you." Emma looked at the note again, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and unease. None of this made sense. Who would go to such lengths to bring this puppy into her life? And why now, on her wedding day? "I think someone wanted you to have her," her mother said softly, breaking the tense silence. "Maybe they thought you'd understand why." Emma's father chimed in, his voice gruff but thoughtful. "Or maybe this is about more than just the puppy. Maybe it's about something, or someone, from your past." The mention of her past made Emma's heart tighten. Memories of Daisy, of her childhood home, and of the quiet, unspoken pain that had lingered after her father's illness years ago all came rushing back. But none of it explained why this stranger, or whoever had left the note, would choose this moment to resurface in such an unusual way. She looked at Paul, her gaze piercing. "You're sure there was nothing else? No clue about who might have left her or why?" Paul shook his head. "I swear, that's all I know. I found her, I cared for her, and when I saw your name connected to her, I thought bringing her here might help answer some questions." Emma sighed, frustration and confusion bubbling inside her. She turned to James, searching his face for reassurance. "What do we do now?" James placed a hand on her shoulder, his calm presence grounding her. "We take it one step at a time," he said. let's figure out where this little one came from, and maybe the rest will start to make sense." Paul hesitated. "I can stay and help, if you want," he offered awkwardly. Emma studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. Despite his nervous demeanor, he seemed genuine, just as lost in this strange situation as she was. She nodded reluctantly. "All right. Stay. But I'll need the truth if anything else comes to light." Paul nodded earnestly. "You have my word." As the conversation settled, Emma looked back down at the puppy in her arms. Despite everything, the tiny creature seemed content now, her soft breaths and occasional wag of her tail showing a small sense of comfort. Charlie nuzzled closer, as if offering his own kind of reassurance. Emma's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice from the crowd. "Emma, love," her grandmother called, standing from her seat. She walked over slowly, her cane tapping softly against the floor. "Grandma?" Emma said, surprised. Her grandmother's kind but weathered face was alight with curiosity. "Let me see that tag again," she said, holding out her hand. Emma handed it to her, watching as the older woman studied the engraving closely. For a moment, her expression didn't change, but then her eyes widened, and her mouth fell open slightly. "What is it, Grandma?" Emma asked urgently. Her grandmother looked up, her voice trembling. "I've seen this name and date before," she said. "A long time ago." Emma's heart pounded. "Where?" Her grandmother hesitated, glancing at the puppy before meeting Emma's gaze. "It's tied to something your grandfather once told me. A story about a promise he made, to protect someone he cared deeply about. I think this might be connected to him." Emma felt her knees go weak as the weight of her grandmother's words sank in. "Grandpa," she whispered. Her grandmother nodded, her expression both wistful and serious. "There's something I need to tell you, Emma. Something I thought was just a story, but now, I'm not so sure." As her grandmother began to speak, Emma knew the answers she'd been seeking were finally within reach. But she also sensed that the truth, whatever it was, would change everything. Emma's grandmother sat down on one of the chairs near the edge of the room, her cane resting against the armrest as she motioned for Emma to join her. The guests, still watching the drama unfold, whispered amongst themselves, though a few had turned their attention to their phones or conversations, seemingly resigned to the unusual delay. Emma's mother stood close by, her face a mixture of worry and curiosity, while James stayed at Emma's side, his presence steady and grounding. Taking a deep breath, her grandmother began. "Your grandfather, he wasn't always the man you knew. Before he met me, he had another life. There were things he kept from most of the family, things he only shared with me much later. He had a way of crossing paths with people who were in trouble. He wasn't the type to turn a blind eye." Emma leaned in closer, her heart racing. "What kind of trouble, Grandma?" Her grandmother's gaze softened, and her voice grew quieter. "One of the people he helped was a young woman named Margaret. This was long before you were born, back in the early 60s. Margaret was in a bad spot, running from someone, or something, that she never fully explained. Your grandfather gave her a place to stay for a while, helped her get back on her feet. She left eventually, but not before making him promise something." "What did she ask him to promise?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her grandmother hesitated, glancing at the puppy nestled in Emma's arms. "She made him promise that if anything ever happened to her, he would look after her daughter." Emma blinked in surprise. "Her daughter? But what does that have to do with this puppy? And the name Daisy?" "That's the part one don't fully understand," her grandmother admitted, her brow furrowing. "But Margaret had a dog named Daisy, a golden retriever. She said Daisy was the only thing that had kept her going during her darkest times. I always thought she named the dog after something, or someone, important. But I never asked. When Margaret left, we never heard from her again. Your grandfather looked for her, but it was like she'd vanished. Over the years, he wondered what had happened to her, but he never found out. Emma's mind spun as she tried to piece together the fragments of the story. Could the puppy in her arms somehow be tied to this woman her grandfather had once helped? It seemed impossible. Too many years had passed, too many connections lost to time. Yet the coincidence of the name and the sudden appearance of the puppy felt too deliberate to ignore. Do you think someone connected to Margaret left the puppy here? James asked, his expression thoughtful. Maybe they found something that led them to your family. Or maybe it's her daughter, Emma said softly, the realization striking her. What if Margaret's daughter found out about my grandfather's promise? What if she's the one who brought the puppy? Paul, still standing awkwardly nearby, spoke up. It's possible. If someone wanted to honor an old promise, they might think this was the way to do it. But why would they go to all this trouble instead of just contacting you? Emma stared down at the puppy, who was now resting peacefully against her chest. Maybe they couldn't, she said quietly. Or maybe they didn't want to involve me directly. This might be their way of keeping the promise alive. Her grandmother nodded slowly, her expression wistful. Your grandfather always believed promises were sacred, even when they seemed impossible to keep. If this is tied to him, then someone must have truly trusted him. But why now? Emma asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Why on my wedding day? Why bring this into my life at this exact moment? Timing might not be a coincidence, James said. Maybe they thought this was the only way to get your attention. The guests' chatter grew louder, a subtle reminder of the world waiting for the ceremony to resume. The wedding coordinator, who had been pacing near the back of the room, finally approached again. Emma, I understand this is important, but we really need to decide what to do. The guests are getting restless. Emma felt torn, her heart tugging in two directions. She wanted to honor the day she and James had planned for so long, but she couldn't ignore the mystery unfolding before her. The weight of the note, the tag, and the puppy's sudden appearance made it impossible to simply set everything aside. James touched her arm gently. Whatever you decide, I'm with you, he said. We can postpone, or we can move forward with the ceremony and deal with this afterward. But you don't have to figure it all out right now. Emma looked into his eyes, her gratitude for his unwavering support washing over her. I can't ignore this, she said softly. But I also don't want to ruin today. Maybe we can do both. Her grandmother smiled faintly. Your grandfather would have been proud of you, Emma. You have his heart. The room grew quieter as Emma turned to address the guests, who were now watching her with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Thank you all for your patience, she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. This has been unexpected, to say the least. But James and I have decided to move forward with the ceremony. We'll figure out the rest later. The guests broke into polite applause, some nodding approvingly, others whispering amongst themselves. Emma handed the puppy to her mother for safekeeping, giving the little creature one last gentle stroke before turning back to James. As the music began to play again, Emma took James's arm and began walking down the aisle. But even as she smiled at the faces of friends and family, the questions lingered in the back of her mind, unanswered and insistent. Who had brought the puppy? What was the connection to her grandfather's past? And most importantly, what was the real meaning behind the mysterious message that had turned her wedding day into something far more complicated, and far more significant, than she could have ever imagined? As Emma and James stood at the altar, the vows they had spent months preparing tumbled from their lips with heartfelt emotion. The words were beautiful, the kind that could bring tears to anyone's eyes, but Emma found it difficult to fully immerse herself in the moment. Her mind kept drifting back to the events of the past hour, the puppy, the note, her grandmother's story about her grandfather's mysterious promise. It all felt like a puzzle she didn't have the pieces to solve. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the room erupted in applause. Emma's smile, though genuine, was laced with an undercurrent of unease. James squeezed her hand as they made their way back down the aisle together, a silent promise that he understood the storm brewing inside her. The reception began in earnest, with music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Guests mingled, congratulated the couple, and gushed over how stunning Emma looked. But the strange events from earlier hung over her like a shadow. Her mother had taken the puppy out to the garden, and Emma caught glimpses of the little dog playing near a flower bed, her boundless energy a stark contrast to the weighty questions she represented. Her grandmother sat at a table near the corner, looking deep in thought. Emma approached her cautiously, her bouquet still clutched tightly in her hands. "Grandma," she began softly, "do you think Grandpa knew this would happen? That somehow, this promise he made would find its way back to us?" Her grandmother looked up, her wise eyes meeting Emma's. "I don't think your grandfather ever expected his promise to come full circle," she said. "But he always believed that what's meant to be will find a way. Maybe this is fate working its magic." Emma nodded, though the answer did little to calm her restless mind. Fate or not, the mystery felt far from over. She excused herself and made her way to the garden, where her mother stood watching the puppy chase a butterfly. "She's a sweetheart," her mother said, smiling as Emma approached. "It's hard to imagine anyone abandoning her." Emma knelt beside the puppy, who immediately ran over and licked her hand. "You're not just any dog, are you?" she whispered. "You're here for a reason. I just don't know what it is yet." Paul's voice startled her as he came up from behind. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone hesitant. "If this is connected to your grandfather, maybe there's something in his old belongings that could help. Letters, photos, anything that might give us more clues." Emma straightened, considering the idea. Her grandfather had passed away years ago, leaving behind a small box of keepsakes that her grandmother had tucked away in the attic. She'd never thought much about it before, but now, it felt like a potential key to unlocking the mystery. "You're right," she said, determination rising in her chest. "I'll look through his things. There has to be something there." James joined them, catching the tail end of the conversation. "Do you want me to come with you?" he asked, his concern evident. Emma shook her head. "No, I'll go alone for now. I need to focus." As the evening wore on, Emma slipped away from the reception and headed to her grandmother's house, which was just a short drive away. The attic was dimly lit and filled with the smell of old wood and dust. She found the box easily. It was labeled with her grandfather's name in neat handwriting. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, she opened the lid and began sifting through its contents. There were old photographs, letters, and trinkets from her grandparents' travels. Emma's fingers brushed against a small leather notebook, its pages worn and yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Most of the entries were mundane, notes about the weather, grocery lists, and reminders to fix things around the house. But as she flipped further back, something caught her attention. Asterisk met Margaret today. She's scared, but she's strong. Said she's being followed. Promised to help her. She's got a little girl named Lily and a dog named Daisy. She won't say much about who's after her, but I can tell she's running from something serious. Asterisk Emma's breath hitched. Her grandmother's story had been right. This Margaret wasn't just a fleeting figure from her grandfather's past. She was someone he had cared deeply about, someone he had risked helping despite the danger. She kept reading, her heart pounding with every word. Asterisk Margaret left today. Said she couldn't stay any longer, didn't want to put us in danger. She made me promise to look after Lily if anything ever happened to her. Said Daisy was a part of the promise too. I hope she finds peace, wherever she's going. Asterisk. Emma closed the notebook, her hands trembling. Whoever had brought the puppy here had to know about this promise. But was it Lily? Or someone else connected to Margaret's life? As she sat in the quiet attic, the weight of the mystery settled over her once more. The answers felt tantalizingly close, yet still out of reach. She realized then that this was about more than her grandfather's promise. It was about unfinished business, a thread connecting the past to the present in ways she couldn't yet fully understand. With the notebook clutched tightly in her hands, Emma made a silent vow to uncover the truth, even if it meant unraveling secrets that had been buried for decades. Emma descended the attic stairs slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of her discovery. The leather notebook felt fragile in her hands, yet it carried a history so deeply entwined with her own. The soft murmurs of the wedding reception back at the venue seemed miles away now, distant and unimportant compared to the storm of questions swirling in her mind. Back at the house, James was waiting by the garden with Paul and Emma's mother, who was still holding the puppy. The evening light was fading, casting long shadows across the lawn. Emma walked toward them, her steps steady but her emotions anything but. I found something, she said, her voice breaking the silence. She held up the notebook, her fingers trembling slightly. It's all here. My grandfather's promise, Margaret, Lily, and Daisy. It's real. Everything Grandma said, it's all true. James reached out to steady her, his hand brushing hers. What does it say? He asked gently. Emma opened the notebook to the entry she had read in the attic and began to read aloud, her voice firm despite the knot in her throat. As she spoke, she watched their faces shift, Paul's eyes widen in shock, her mother's expression softened with understanding, and James's jaw tightened with focus. When she finished, there was a pause, the kind that stretched uncomfortably long, as though everyone was processing the gravity of what they'd just heard. So, Paul said finally, breaking the silence. That means this Lily, she might still be out there. Or someone who knows her. Maybe she's the one who brought the puppy here, James suggested. She'd have every reason to, especially if she found out about the promise. But why not just come to us directly? Emma asked, frustration creeping into her voice. Why all the secrecy? Why the note, the tag? And dropping the puppy here like some kind of puzzle? Her mother spoke softly, her gaze on the puppy. Maybe she didn't feel she could. Or maybe she's still running from whatever Margaret was trying to escape all those years ago. The thought sent a chill through Emma. If someone, or something, had been after Margaret back then, could that same danger still exist now? And if so, had it followed Daisy here? As if sensing the tension, the puppy whimpered and nuzzled closer to Emma's mother. Emma crouched down, her hands gently stroking Daisy's soft fur. The dog's warmth grounded her, even as her mind raced with possibilities. We need to find her, Emma said suddenly, her voice filled with determination. If Lily is still out there, she deserves answers as much as we do. And if she's in trouble, Paul interrupted, his tone cautious. How are we supposed to find someone after all this time? There's barely anything to go on. No last name, no address, nothing. Emma stood, clutching the notebook tightly. There's always a trail, she said. People leave pieces of themselves behind, even if they try to disappear. Margaret left Daisy, and Lily might have left something, too. We just have to start looking. James nodded. We'll help you, Emma. Whatever it takes. Paul hesitated, his face conflicted. I don't know if I should get involved anymore. I'm already in over my head, and honestly, I'm not sure what my place is in all this. Emma turned to him, her expression firm but not unkind. Paul, you brought Daisy to me. Whether you meant to or not, you're part of this now. And if there's a chance you can help us figure this out, I need you to stay." Paul sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he said reluctantly. "I'll stay. But I hope you know what you're getting into." Emma's mother spoke again, her voice carrying a note of warning. "You should be careful, Emma. Whatever Margaret was running from, it could still be dangerous." Emma nodded. "I know. But I can't ignore this. I have to see it through." The group fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of the task ahead settling over them. The sky had grown darker now, the first stars beginning to appear. The reception continued faintly in the background, a reminder of the life Emma had planned to start with James, a life that now seemed temporarily on hold. Just then, a sound broke through the quiet, a faint rustling from the bushes near the garden's edge. Emma froze, her heart pounding. Daisy perked up, her ears alert and her small body tensing. James moved closer to Emma, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Everyone turned toward the sound, their eyes scanning the shadows. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her hair disheveled and her clothes wrinkled as if she'd been traveling for days. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and desperation. In her arms, she clutched a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. "Emma," the woman said, her voice trembling. Emma stepped forward, her heart in her throat. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Who are you?" The woman took a shaky breath, her grip tightening on the bundle. "My name is Lily," she said. "And I think you've been looking for me." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through Emma's body. This was it, the moment she'd been searching for. But as Lily's eyes filled with tears and her voice broke with emotion, Emma realized that finding Lily was only the beginning. The real story was still waiting to unfold, and she had no idea how deep it would go. Emma's breath caught in her throat as Lily's words settled over her like a weight too heavy to bear. She barely noticed James squeezing her hand or her mother stepping protectively closer to her. All Emma could focus on was the woman standing before her, this stranger who somehow felt like a missing piece of her family's history, now alive and trembling in the cool evening air. "You're Lily?" Emma finally managed, her voice shaky but firm. The woman nodded, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows around them, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear at any moment. "Yes," she whispered. "I'm Margaret's daughter." A ripple of tension passed through the group. Paul's face paled, and Emma's mother clutched Daisy a little tighter, the puppy squirming slightly in her arms. James's steady presence at Emma's side grounded her, but even he looked shaken. "How did you find us?" Emma asked, her mind racing with questions. "Why now?" Lily glanced down at the bundle she was holding, as though seeking strength from it. She stepped closer, her voice trembling with urgency. "I've been looking for you for months, trying to figure out if I could trust you. My mom always told me about your grandfather. She said he was the only person she ever trusted after everything. When I found out he was gone, I didn't know where to turn. Then I found an old letter." Emma's heart quickened. "A letter?" Lily nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "It was from him. He wrote to my mom years ago, but she never sent it back. It was tucked away with her things when she passed. In it, he promised to keep me safe if she couldn't. He even mentioned Daisy. I thought maybe you would understand." Emma's chest tightened, a swirl of emotions overwhelming her, sadness for Lily's loss, anger at the circumstances that had led her here, and a deep, unshakable sense of responsibility. "Why didn't you come to us sooner?" she asked softly. Lily hesitated, glancing around nervously again. "I didn't know if I could trust you," she admitted. And there's someone who's been watching me. I couldn't risk leading them to you. But Daisy, she looked at the puppy with a flicker of hope in her eyes. She was supposed to be my signal. If you took her in, it meant you were the kind of people my mom believed you'd be. Emma felt a shiver run down her spine. Who's been watching you? Lily's expression darkened, her hands tightening on the bundle. I don't know who they are, but they've been after me ever since my mom died. I think it has to do with what she was running from all those years ago. I don't know the whole story, she never told me everything. But I think it's connected to something my mom knew, something dangerous. Paul shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting toward the darkened edges of the garden. Are you saying someone might have followed you here? He asked, his voice tense. Lily nodded, her voice barely audible. I think so. I tried to cover my tracks, but I can't be sure. Emma's stomach churned. The idea that someone dangerous might be lurking nearby sent a wave of fear through her. She looked at James, who immediately understood. We need to get inside, James said firmly. If someone's out there, it's not safe for us to be out here. Lily hesitated, her body tense as if she might flee. But Emma stepped forward, her hand outstretched. You're safe with us, she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out. But we can't do that out here. After a moment's hesitation, Lily nodded and allowed Emma to guide her toward the house. The group moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the still night air. Paul brought up the rear, his eyes darting nervously to every shadow. Inside, the tension was palpable. The warm lights of the house contrasted starkly with the unease that had settled over them. Daisy, now sitting on the floor at Emma's feet, let out a small bark, as if sensing the collective anxiety. Lily finally unwrapped the bundle she'd been clutching, revealing a weathered envelope and a small, framed photo. She handed them to Emma, her hands trembling. Emma took the photo first. It was of a young woman, Margaret, she assumed, smiling softly with a little girl in her arms. A golden retriever sat by their side, its tail blurred in motion as if wagging enthusiastically. Daisy's namesake, Emma realized. The envelope was addressed in her grandfather's handwriting, the ink faded but unmistakable. Emma carefully opened it, her eyes scanning the words. Asterisk Margaret, if you're reading this, I hope you found peace. But if not, I want you to know that my promise still stands. If Lily ever needs help, she has a family here. Daisy will be a part of that promise, just as she's been a part of your strength. Trust that I'll do everything I can to protect her and give her the life she deserves. Earl asterisk Emma's eyes blurred with tears. Her grandfather's words, written with such care and conviction, felt like a bridge between past and present. She handed the letter to James, who read it silently, his expression unreadable. Lily, Emma said gently, you're part of our family now. Whatever danger you're in, we'll face it together. Lily's lip quivered, and she quickly wiped away a tear. Thank you, she whispered. I didn't know if I'd ever feel safe again. But even as the words left her lips, a sharp noise outside shattered the moment. A loud thud echoed through the night, followed by the sound of footsteps. Emma's blood ran cold. Someone's here, James said grimly, his hand instinctively moving to shield Emma. The group froze, their eyes locked on the door as the tension reached its breaking point. Whatever was about to happen, Emma knew they were standing at the edge of something far bigger than they could have imagined. The group stood frozen, their breaths shallow as the footsteps grew louder outside. Emma's mind raced, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified in the suffocating silence. Daisy let out a low growl, her small frame tense and ready. James moved toward the door, his movements deliberate and protective. Stay behind me, he murmured, his eyes scanning the windows. Paul grabbed a heavy candlestick from the mantel, his knuckles white around the handle. Emma instinctively reached for Lily, pulling her closer. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the world was still, as if even the wind dared not move. Then came a knock, sharp, deliberate, and completely out of place in the oppressive tension. Emma exchanged a look with James. His brow furrowed, and he motioned for everyone to stay quiet. He approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. What he saw made him freeze, his expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "It's a police officer," James whispered, turning back to the group. Relief washed over the room, but it was tinged with suspicion. Why would the police show up now, at this precise moment? Emma's thoughts churned. Had someone called them? Or had Lily's pursuers somehow involved them? James opened the door a crack, his body tense. A man in a uniform stood on the porch, his face partially shadowed by the dim porch light. "Good evening," the officer said, his tone professional but firm. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Do you mind if I ask a few questions?" James hesitated, glancing back at Emma. She gave a small nod, signaling it was okay to let him in. The officer stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the room. When his gaze landed on Lily, his expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Emma to notice. "Ma'am," the officer addressed Lily directly, his tone suddenly more direct. "Would you mind stepping outside for a moment? I have a few questions for you." Emma's stomach tightened. Something felt off. "Why does she need to go outside?" she asked, her voice firmer than she expected. The officer's gaze shifted to Emma. "It's just a standard procedure, ma'am. We've had reports that match her description. I need to confirm a few details." "No," Lily said suddenly, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not going anywhere." The officer took a step closer, his hand resting on his belt. "I'm not asking, ma'am. This will go much smoother if you cooperate." James stepped between Lily and the officer, his jaw set. "She's not going anywhere until you tell us what's going on," he said, his voice steady but edged with warning. The officer's calm demeanor cracked, just for a moment, before he straightened and reached for his radio. But before he could speak into it, Daisy barked loudly, startling everyone. The little dog darted forward, snapping at the officer's heels. "Daisy, stop!" Emma called, but the puppy's outburst had already shifted the dynamic in the room. The officer stepped back, his composure faltering as Daisy growled fiercely. And then it happened, a flash of movement that Emma barely registered. Lily grabbed the officer's radio from his belt and threw it across the room, where it clattered to the floor. "He's not real," she cried, her voice breaking. "He's not a real cop." Chaos erupted. The man lunged for Lily, but James tackled him, the two crashing into a side table and knocking over a lamp. Paul moved quickly, pinning the man's arms while James restrained him. The officer, if that's what he truly was, struggled, but it was clear he hadn't anticipated resistance. Emma grabbed Daisy, who was still barking furiously, and backed toward the corner with Lily. "Who is he?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking. Lily's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "But he's not here to help us." The man stopped struggling, his face twisting into an eerie smirk. "You have no idea what you're involved in," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Then tell us," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "What is this about? Why are you after Lily?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he laughed, a low, unsettling sound that made Emma's skin crawl. James tightened his grip, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Start talking," he growled. "Who sent you?" The man's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You're in over your heads," he said. "Walk away now, and maybe you'll still have time to save yourselves." Lily clutched Emma's arm, her nails digging into her skin. "He works for them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The people who were after my mom. They've found me." Emma's heart sank. Whatever her grandfather had been protecting Margaret from, it hadn't ended with her. And now it was here, threatening to destroy everything. As the weight of Lily's words settled over the group, the man's smirk returned, more sinister than before. "You think you've uncovered something," he said, his tone mocking. "But you've only scratched the surface. There's so much more you don't know." Emma's mind raced, her grandfather's words echoing in her memory. If Lily ever needs help, she has a family here. She had made a promise too, a silent vow to carry on what her grandfather had started. But now, it was clear the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. The sound of distant sirens broke through the tension, growing louder with each passing second. The man's expression shifted to one of panic, and for the first time, Emma saw a crack in his composure. "They're coming for me," he muttered, almost to himself. Then he looked at Emma, his eyes dark and piercing. "But don't think this is over. You've already been marked." Before anyone could react, he shoved James and Paul aside with a burst of strength and bolted for the door. The group chased after him, but by the time they reached the porch, he was gone, swallowed by the night. The sirens grew louder, and within moments, 2 patrol cars pulled into the driveway. Real officers stepped out, their faces serious as they approached the house. Emma's mind spun as she tried to piece together what had just happened. The man's warning echoed in her ears. "You've already been marked." Whatever was coming next, Emma knew they were far from safe. The past wasn't just a story to uncover anymore, it was a storm hurtling toward them, and they were standing directly in its path. Emma's heart raced as she stared at the spot where she had seen the shadow. For a moment, everything seemed to blur, her thoughts, the room, the people around her. The urgency in the air grew thick. "Did you see that?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. James turned quickly toward the window, his expression hardening. "Stay low," he said, his voice a low command. He motioned for Paul to follow him. They moved toward the back door, but as they did, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Emma felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "Lily, stay close," she urged, her voice frantic. Her eyes darted from one person to the next, but the fear on Lily's face only mirrored her own. The house was silent now, the faint sound of the wind outside the only noise in the otherwise oppressive stillness. Then, the sharp ring of Emma's phone shattered the silence. She picked it up, the screen showing an unknown number. Her fingers trembled as she answered. Emma, the voice on the other end was familiar, but it sent a jolt of panic through her. It was her grandfather's old assistant, the one who had helped him with his investigations before he passed away. "I need you to listen carefully." "Don, what's going on? Where are you? I need answers, now." Emma's voice was strained with the weight of everything that had happened. "There's no time. Listen, you're in danger. You don't understand what you've stumbled upon, but you need to trust me." "What do you mean? Who are these people? What do they want with Lily?" "They want something your grandfather hid, a secret that, if it's uncovered, could change everything. They've been looking for it for years, and now they know you're close. They'll stop at nothing to make sure you never find it." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "What secret? What are you talking about?" Don hesitated. "It's not just about Lily, Emma. It's about the family legacy, everything your grandfather was involved in. And you're standing at the heart of it now." Before Emma could respond, the line went dead. She stared at the phone in disbelief. The room felt suddenly suffocating. James and Paul returned to the room, their faces grim. "There's someone outside," James said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to move. Now." The urgency in his voice snapped Emma out of her haze. They didn't have time to think, only to act. She grabbed Lily's hand, pulling her along as they moved quickly to the back of the house. But before they could even reach the door, a sharp knock rang out from the front. A voice called from the other side. "Lily, I know you're in there. It's time to finish this." The coldness of the words sent a chill through Emma. This wasn't just a threat anymore, it was a warning. Whoever was behind this knew they were close. "Stay behind me," James said, pushing Emma and Lily toward the back door. "We'll get out through the woods. Paul, stay with us." But as they turned, the unmistakable sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. Emma's breath caught in her throat. They were running out of time. They slipped into the woods behind the house, moving quickly through the trees, their steps muffled by the thick underbrush. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like someone, or something, was right behind them. They kept moving, the darkness pressing in, until they reached an old cabin. It was run down, hidden well enough that it seemed like no one had used it in years. But Emma's grandfather had once mentioned a safe place, somewhere no one would think to look. "This is it," James whispered, as they hurried inside. The cabin was small but sturdy, and Emma immediately went to the old fireplace, remembering her grandfather's cryptic words. "If things go south, go here." She started moving bricks, her hands shaking as she tried to remember the exact spot. Finally, she found it, a hidden compartment. Inside was a worn leather journal, just as her grandfather had described. She pulled it out, hands trembling with anticipation. But as she opened the journal, her breath caught. The pages were filled with details, maps, symbols, and notes in her grandfather's handwriting, but one page stood out. It was a photograph of a man she recognized. The officer who had attacked them earlier. "No," Emma breathed. "This can't be. He's one of them. He's not working alone." She looked up at James, her mind racing. "This is bigger than we thought. He's part of something much larger." The sound of footsteps in the distance sent a jolt through her. They weren't alone. Someone was getting closer. Emma quickly shut the journal, stuffing it into her bag as she motioned for everyone to stay quiet. The footsteps drew nearer, until a figure appeared in the doorway. But it wasn't the officer, no, it was someone else entirely. Someone she hadn't expected. Lily gasped, her face drained of color. "No, it can't be you." Standing in the doorway, framed by the dim light from the outside, was a woman. Emma's heart dropped when she saw the familiar face, the face of Margaret. But it wasn't the same. This woman had the same eyes, the same strong features, but there was something darker about her now. Something that wasn't quite right. "You shouldn't have come here, Emma," the woman said coldly, her gaze locking onto Emma's. "This was never meant for you to find." Emma's mind reeled. "What are you talking about? Who are you?" The woman smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the smile of someone who had already won. "I'm Margaret's sister," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "And you've been playing into their hands this whole time." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying? How is this possible? Everything your grandfather was involved in, all the secrets he kept, he was working for us. You've been chasing shadows, thinking you're uncovering the truth, but you're just part of a much bigger game. And now, you've brought it all to me." The last words hung in the air as Emma's world seemed to collapse around her. The woman stepped forward, her hand outstretched, and in that moment, Emma knew, the fight was far from over, but this was only the beginning of a much darker story. Emma stood frozen, her heart pounding as Margaret's sister stepped further into the cabin. The weight of her words lingered in the air, thick with the kind of cold certainty that only came from someone who knew exactly how everything would unfold. Emma's mind spun, trying to piece together the puzzle that had been shattering around her for days. But now, it was clear, nothing about this had been what it seemed. "You're lying," Emma finally managed to say, her voice trembling but defiant. "My grandfather was trying to protect us." "Protect Lily?" Margaret's sister laughed softly, the sound cruel and empty. "Your grandfather was protecting himself, Emma. Protecting his own secrets. He was just another player in a much larger game. And now you're tangled up in it, whether you like it or not." Lily, still in shock, stepped back, her hand clutching Emma's arm tightly. "No. No, this can't be true. My mother, she wouldn't have trusted you." Margaret's sister's gaze softened, but it wasn't kindness, it was the kind of look someone gives when they know they've already won. "Your mother didn't have a choice. None of us did. We were all caught up in something too big to escape from." Her eyes flicked toward the journal Emma was holding, the one she had just discovered in the cabin. "You really thought you could hide this from me? That journal is the key, Emma. It's always been the key." Emma felt a cold shiver run through her as she tightened her grip on the journal. "What is this? What's really going on?" Margaret's sister's lips curled into a twisted smile. "You're about to find out. All of it." The door slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, and suddenly, the cabin felt much smaller, more suffocating. Emma's pulse quickened as she glanced at James, Paul, and Lily, who all seemed equally trapped in the web of secrets they had unwittingly stumbled into. The room seemed to close in on them, and Emma knew that whatever was coming next, they were running out of time. "We can still leave," James said in a low voice, his hand hovering near the door. "We can get out of here. Go to the police." No, Margaret's sister's voice was firm. "There's no escaping this, James. The moment you found that journal, everything changed." Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "Then why don't you just take it? Take it and leave us alone." Margaret's sister shook her head slowly, almost pityingly. "It's not about the journal. It's about what it represents. Your grandfather wasn't just hiding information, he was guarding something far more dangerous. And now, you're the one who has to carry that burden." A deep unease settled in Emma's stomach. "Burden? What do you mean?" The woman took another step forward, her cold eyes locking onto Emma's. "It's too late to back out, Emma. The truth has already found you. All I need to do is make sure you understand why it's so dangerous for you to know what's inside that journal." "Why?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything they had fought to protect. "Why are you doing this? You don't have to do this." Margaret's sister's expression flickered with something close to regret before it vanished, replaced by a steely resolve. "I don't have a choice anymore. None of us did." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Emma's mind raced, each new piece of the puzzle coming faster, yet making less sense. And then, just when she thought she might break under the weight of it all, a new voice rang out from behind them. "Step away from her." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, half expecting it to be another threat, but the figure standing in the doorway wasn't an enemy at all. It was someone she hadn't seen in years. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure in the dim light. Standing tall and unwavering, with a familiar look of determination in his eyes, was none other than her father. "Dad," she gasped, unable to believe what she was seeing. She hadn't seen him since he had disappeared all those years ago, leaving behind nothing but questions. What are you doing here?" Her father's face was gaunt, his clothes torn, but his presence felt like a lifeline in the chaos that had consumed them. "I never wanted you to find out like this," he said, his voice rough but steady. "But I had to come. I had to make sure you understood the full truth." Margaret, he looked at Margaret's sister, his gaze hardening, was never meant to be the one who took over. Margaret's sister narrowed her eyes. "You always were the wild card, Robert. It's too late for you to stop this. Emma's already too deep." Emma's father, Robert, stepped forward, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. "No, you're wrong. She's the only one who can end it. You've been manipulating everything, controlling every move, but Emma is the key to stopping it all." The room went deathly still. Emma's mind reeled with the revelation. Her father, her real father, had been part of this twisted game all along. The secrets, the lies, the danger they'd been running from, it had all been tied to him, to what he knew and what he'd kept hidden from her all these years. "I never wanted you to be involved in this," her father continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I didn't have a choice. No one did." He looked at Emma, his gaze filled with a deep, unspoken apology. "I thought I could protect you from it. But now, the only way to protect you is for you to destroy everything. Destroy the truth before it destroys you." Emma's mind swirled as she tried to make sense of everything. Her father, Margaret's sister, the journal, it all felt like a nightmare that was spiraling out of control. But now, she realized something. They were all connected. And whatever truth was locked away in that journal was more powerful than she could have ever imagined. She felt a sense of clarity cutting through the chaos. There was only one thing she could do now. She had to end it. For good. And the only way out of this, the only way to keep Lily, and herself, safe, was to destroy whatever secret her grandfather had fought so desperately to keep buried. "Give me the journal," her father said, his voice firm. Emma looked at the journal in her hands, the weight of it suddenly feeling like a chain around her wrist. But she knew what she had to do. As Margaret's sister stepped closer, a satisfied look creeping onto her face, Emma made her choice. "No," she said, holding the journal tighter. "This ends now." Margaret's sister took another step forward, her eyes narrowing in contempt as she watched Emma grip the journal tighter. "You don't understand, do you?" she sneered. "You're out of your depth. That journal doesn't just hold a secret, it holds power. The kind of power that can ruin everything if it falls into the wrong hands." Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. She wanted to believe that she was doing the right thing, but everything had become so tangled, so confusing. Was her father truly here to help her, or had he come to manipulate her, just like Margaret's sister had? Her father's gaze softened, pleading. "Please, Emma. It's too dangerous. The world isn't ready for what's in there. If it gets out, it'll tear everything apart. People you care about will suffer." "I don't care about the consequences anymore," Emma said, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. "I care about the truth. I want to know what's really going on." Margaret's sister let out a sharp laugh. "You still think you can handle the truth? You have no idea what you're dealing with. That journal is the key to everything. If you think you can destroy it, you're wrong. You don't even know what you're protecting or what you're letting go." A sickening chill spread through Emma as she realized just how high the stakes had become. Her father's face had gone pale, and his eyes were filled with a mix of fear and regret. He looked at Margaret's sister, then back at Emma. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "That journal, it's not just a record. It's a map. A map to something that's been buried for decades. If you think destroying it will keep you safe, you're wrong. It's already too late." Emma's head spun, her grip on the journal faltering as the weight of her father's words sank in. "A map? A map to what? Margaret's sister stepped forward, her voice laced with disdain. To a treasure, Emma. But not just any treasure. The kind that could change everything. Your grandfather was part of something much larger than you know. And now, that responsibility falls on you. Emma's breath hitched. A treasure? She glanced at the journal again, the pages so unassuming, so ordinary, but now, they felt like a ticking time bomb. A treasure that could change everything? Was it wealth, power, something more dangerous? Her father shook his head, his eyes pleading. No, Emma. It's not a treasure like you think. It's a legacy of destruction. The people who want that treasure aren't just after gold or riches. They want control, power. And if it's opened, if you open it, it could unleash chaos. Lily's voice trembled from beside her. What are you saying? You mean this isn't about money? What are we really dealing with? Margaret's sister stepped closer, her voice low and venomous. You still don't get it, do you? It's not about money, it's about an ancient secret that's been passed down for generations. Your grandfather tried to protect you, but he couldn't keep it buried forever. And now, the only thing standing in the way of all of you getting dragged into this is that journal. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. The weight of it all was overwhelming. The journal wasn't just a family heirloom, it was a key, a weapon, and now, it was her responsibility. But the more she listened, the more her mind rebelled. How could this be true? How could something as simple as a journal be so powerful, so dangerous? Why didn't you tell me this before? Emma shouted, her voice breaking. Why didn't you warn me? We've all been caught up in your game, and now you're just dumping it all on me? Her father stepped forward again, a pained expression on his face. I didn't want you to have to make this choice. I wanted to protect you. But now, the choice is yours. If you destroy that journal, you end everything. You end their plans. But if you open it, if you let them get their hands on it, the world will never be the same. Emma's mind was a blur, but there was one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't let the journal fall into the wrong hands. Whatever it was, whoever wanted it, it was too dangerous. The fear in her father's eyes, the desperation in his voice, told her all she needed to know. I won't let them use it, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Margaret's sister's smile widened, cruel and knowing. You think you can stop them? You're just one person. And even if you destroy the journal, there will always be others who will seek it out. The cycle will never end. Emma clenched her fists, refusing to back down. I'll end it. I'll destroy it. Her father's eyes filled with anguish. No, Emma, please. Don't do this. Emma took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the edges of the journal. The weight of her decision was suffocating. But she knew what she had to do. She had to destroy it. If she didn't, everything, her family, her life, would be lost. But just as she moved toward the fireplace, ready to burn the journal and end the nightmare, a voice called out from the shadows. Stop. The voice was cold, commanding. Emma froze, her heart sinking as the figure stepped into the light. Standing in the doorway was another man, a stranger, but the way he carried himself suggested he wasn't just anyone. He exuded power, control, and something far darker. I'm afraid it's not that simple, the stranger said, his gaze locking with Emma's. You've already made the mistake of opening it. And now, you've sealed your fate. The room seemed to close in around her as the stranger's words hung in the air, thick with finality. She didn't know who he was, but she knew one thing: whatever this man wanted, it was too late to turn back now.